Hello and welcome to SpyHards podcast, where your hosts go deep undercover into the world of spy movies to decipher which films make the knock list. But remember, this information is strictly for your ears only. I'm Agent Scott.
Opium. Uh-oh. And I'm Cam the Provocateur.
Cam is starting on a high.
Yeah, good one. There's a good pun.
Yeah, I'm firing on all cylinders. But we have an interesting film to look at this week. One I've heard mentioned online quite a few times. People have asked us to take a look at, and I'm glad we're finally here. But before we talk about the film, I think we need to introduce our guest. Now, I sent out invitations to our secret tournament on SpyHards Island.
And no one answered.
And no one answered. And so I was left sort of dumbstruck on what I could do. No. We have one man step up to the plate. He is the creator of the Kung Fu Movie Guide website and the host of the Kung Fu Movie Guide podcast. It is Mr. Ben Johnson. Hello, sir. How are you?
Hello there, Scott. Hello there, Cam. Yeah, very well. Thank you so much for inviting me onto your show.
It's good for you to be here. I'm glad you also got dressed for the occasion. You're wearing your what is it? The ritual uniform.
Absolutely, yes.
For on the island, ritual uniforms only here.
Yeah, that's right. It's like Bruce Lee. I'm not attending the morning ritual in uniform.
You're going to get chastised by some strange guy on the side with a clipboard. Yeah. Good stuff. Oh, well, before we get into the actual film itself, let's talk about you a wee bit. Now, I did sort of say off the top, your website, the Kung Fu Movie Guide, and the podcast you have as well. I guess from the sound of it, you like some Kung Fu movies.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, so the website came first, and that was just through, I guess, growing up, just having a passion for watching martial arts movies. Well, initially getting into, I think like all of us probably had that initial Bruce Lee phase and fascination that then led into various other Hong Kong action movies, which was so prevalent and popular around the 90s and 2000s as well. And as we were saying earlier, I think a lot of people's sort of passion for that genre, for some people it may be waned, others it may have sustained, and I think it's sort of stayed with me for many years now. So yeah, just been writing about the genre for quite a few years. The podcast came about, what did we say? 8 years ago? Is that right? It's probably around then. So yeah, it's been running 2015. So yeah, it's a long time. That again was sort of an offshoot from the website in just arranging interviews with people that normally traditionally I would have written up as written interviews that then would have gone onto the website. And then I guess because podcasting was becoming more and more prevalent and more popular medium, it was easy to turn those recordings into potentially a show or at least a format or an idea for a show. And here we are, 90 episodes in, interviewed loads of my heroes. That's the great thing about doing this thing, isn't it? Is you do get to speak to so many heroes, people I watched growing up, and even a lot of the martial arts stars of today, the likes of Joe Taslim or Scott Adkins, or great directors like Gareth Evans did the Raid films. Had so many great people onto the show over the years. So it's been an absolute privilege and a treat, really, just doing that and chatting to these people.
Well, I'm curious, what, if you can remember, was the first martial arts movie that kind of lit the flame, if you will?
Yeah, I do know that. So the big one for me was, interestingly, and related to what we're going to talk about, it wasn't actually Enter the Dragon. It was Dragon, the Bruce Lee story. I don't know if you've seen that one. Did you watch that? 1993, a biopic?
Yeah.
I mean, it takes some great licenses with the truth, shall we say. But as an entertaining look at Bruce Lee's life and achievements, some wonderful performances, great fight scenes. I mean, as a kid, I was absolutely captivated by that movie. Just hadn't really seen anything quite like it. And then that's then evolved into, wanting to learn a bit more about who this Bruce Lee character was, investigate, what some of his movies. And that then obviously then led into actually training and then trying to get into martial arts and trying to find a local kung fu school. Not easy for living in a small town like Swindon, which is where I'm from in the southwest of England. Trying to find a kung fu teacher in Swindon's not easy, but there we are. So that sort of sparks that fascination really, and it's continued ever since.
Well, I was actually going to ask about whether you'd actually gone and studied martial arts as a as a result of watching all these films. And I don't know if you said you struggled to find a place in Swindon, but did you ever find somewhere? Did you get to train at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I learned, got into a school when I was quite young and has continued it throughout being a teenager. So I did find a kung fu school, learned Wing Chun, learned a lot of the animal kung fu styles. Did a bit of kickboxing, just sort of generally dabbled in lots of different things. Learned a bit of wushu, but it's very hard to do all the jumping kicks and when you're 6 foot tall, it's not easy to throw yourself around like the way Jet Li does. So I learned that lesson pretty quick. But I've always had a passion for martial arts and particularly martial arts movies. I suppose it's through osmosis. It's a way of sort of pretending that you can, you're learning these great moves through the films, maybe.
And do you have like a favorite era? You are like the expert at this point. You've watched so many. Is there any particular, period or anything really that kind of jumps out to you in terms of like your favorites to visit or revisit?
Gosh, that is such a good question. I think because this is the beauty of martial arts cinema, I think, in general. I mean, first of all, it dates all the way back to the silent era. So it's certainly not a modern phenomenon. And, the range of different movies that we're looking at here and the different slants that different regions and geographies around the world and how they interpret the martial arts film is super interesting as well, whether it's parts of Southeast Asia, what America did with the martial arts film in the 80s. I've got a real soft spot for those early Van Damme movies, but equally, for me personally, I think if you're looking at a traditional, what I would deem a traditional kung fu movie, a late night kung fu movie that you just want to put on and just watch some amazing fights, action choreography, you can't go wrong with those Sammo Hung films in the 70s. Warriors 2, The Prodigal Son. He was on such a winning streak across the late 70s, early 80s. His choreography is really hard to beat. And then even into his modern day action films that he then made with Jackie Chan in the 80s. I think, if anyone listening to this has not seen, Wheels on Meals or Dragons Forever, yes, rush out and watch those movies. Yeah. So there's loads to choose from. It's hard. It's like choosing a favorite child, I'd say.
Right.
Yeah.
That's entirely fair. Now, I would say though, I think you've proven your credentials pretty well when it comes to a master of these movies, and that's probably the reason why you've written the guide online on them. You're the go-to man. You know them all, and there's a weird sort of symmetry in what we're doing and what your show and website are doing as well. Because as you say, this sort of film, it's not like a 70s or 80s invention. It goes far back. So do spy films. They go all the way back to the silent era, and we've explored them all the way back there as well. But transitioning a little bit, because the film we're talking about this week is a kung fu film, but it's also a spy film. Now, I haven't questioned you about this ahead of time. This is completely fresh. I've never asked you about this either. Ben, what's your thoughts on spy movies?
Gosh, that is a good question.
Hate them.
No. I love a spy movie, but I'd say that my knowledge of spy movies probably don't. There's not many sort of deep cuts there that I can think of. other than the immediate reference points whenever you say a spy movie in my mind is James Bond. I mean, I'd immediately go to Bond as a reference point, as indeed I think we will mention this, the film that we're talking about today, which is a huge James Bond ripoff.
Yeah.
I do enjoy a spy movie, though. I've got to admit, and that's a resilient genre as well, isn't it? They still make good spy movies. It's amazing, isn't it? I always think in my head, gosh, surely they've reached the pinnacle of martial arts movies. They can't get any better than this. So then a film like Ong Bak comes out, and you see Tony Jaa for the first time, and you think, oh gosh, okay, they have actually come up with something quite incredible here. Nothing will beat that. And then a few years pass, and The Raid comes out, and it's, oh my gosh, this is the most incredible thing. And then a few years later, then the John Wick series suddenly comes. It's one of these things that just never seems to die. It's constantly reinventing itself, and that's really exciting. And the spy movie seems, in my view, to do a similar thing as well. And I don't know if you'd agree with that.
It hasn't improved since the 50s.
All downhill. After
what are you talking about? James Mason was the man. Who needs anything else?
Yeah, but would you count things like, I guess, like the Bourne movies and that sort of
for sure,
that sort of thing?
Yeah.
I mean, they really changed the game, and even as it's a great outlet for action as well. And even I guess you could go into the real mainstream and look at what Tom Cruise has done to Mission Impossible movies. I mean, my gosh, they just get more and more exciting over the years. So it's.
Well, I find it to be a very flexible medium. I mean, you mentioned John Wick in terms of kung fu movies. There's also a spy element to those films. There's a clandestine organization, the tables running everything. Like, you could analyze all the John Wick films from a spy lens, and who knows, Monday maybe we will. I think both of our two genres are very flexible.
Yeah, and it does lend itself to action as well in many ways. And I think with I mean, obviously the action will probably vary as I guess to the attention to detail. I think probably where Enter the Dragon. Well, it'll be interesting to get your thoughts on this. Whether I don't know how highly I can rate it as a spy movie, but I can certainly rate it very highly as a martial arts movie.
Well, I think before we get to that, the final question I'll ask before we queue up the film is: you said you like the Bonds. That's sort of your go-to when it comes to spy movies, and that is where a lot of people's heads goes to as well when they think of spy movies, especially Brits. I think sort of programmed into our DNA, like the notes to the Bond theme is basically our DNA structure. But for you, what's one of some of your favorite spy movies? Like, if you could name a couple that you could off the top of your head.
Well, if I'm thinking Bond films immediately, I was a huge Daniel Craig fan, actually. I know they always say that when it comes to Bond, it's the Bond you grew up watching that you like the most, and that would be Pierce Brosnan. But I think Pierce Brosnan's films, probably some of the weaker Bonds, definitely one of the I don't know if that's controversial.
No, swing away.
But just personally, in my opinion, although Goldfinger obviously is fantastic, there are some good ones. I just very much dislike Die Another Day. I think that's terrible. But if you look, I think Daniel Craig's movies have been fantastic. Casino Royale and Skyfall I really enjoyed, and No Time to Die. How good was No Time to Die? My gosh. So I think he had a really strong track record there, and also I guess it's the Bond that represents the age that we're living through now. Again, it's that need to constantly reinvent itself, to make itself relevant to today's audiences. And it will be really interesting to see what the next iteration of Bond looks like. So obviously, I guess they now need to start over, and it'll be interesting to see. The other references around spy films, the obvious ones that I can think of are the ones I've just mentioned there. So I love the Bourne movies, and I do like the Mission Impossible series as well. I think they're really impressive as well.
Well, it's serendipitous timing, really, because we literally just spoke about No Time to Die last week. So there you go. We put Daniel Craig to bed for his final time, and it was a lovely journey we had for those 5 films. So I'm glad you liked them too.
Yeah, you're a fan of who is your favorite Bond then?
Well, I've personally myself, I think I have the same upbringing as you in terms of timings.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I was a Pierce Brosnan guy, but I stuck to Pierce Brosnan. I was very much
yeah.
GoldenEye and Tomorrow Never Dies. You know, if we're speaking of sort of Hong Kong action films, you know, Michelle Yeoh, very
Of
important
course.
to Tomorrow Never Dies. That's how I was introduced to her, actually, funnily enough. So I think Pierce Brosnan is my go-to. Cam's is a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the best is Sean Connery in his
Yeah,
first three movies. But I would say my favorite, probably Roger Moore, just because he's the one I grew up with. So it's like, if I want to watch the best Bond movies, I'm putting on like, the Daniel Craig Casino Royale or Dr. No from Russia with Love. But if I just want to have the hangout with Bond time, it's going to be a Roger Moore one.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I have a soft spot for those ones as well. I think it's yeah, it's whether they've aged particularly well. I'm not too sure, but
Mm,
timeless
timeless. Yeah,
vehicles.
well, I think that segues us over beautifully because it's the same era as Roger Moore. I guess all that's left to say is enter the cam. Tell us all about it.
Oh my God. Yes, we are here this week to talk about the 1973 Bruce Lee epic Enter the Dragon.
Yes, we hear you. We're here to talk about it. Enter the Dragon. It's time to finally do it. Now, before we get to sort of the letterbox.com synopsis, I'm actually curious to everyone in the room your sort of first experiences of Enter the Dragon. And Ben, you're our esteemed host, the master here in this secret island, the SpyHards Island. When did you first come across Enter the Dragon in sort of your journey into kung fu movies?
this was a really early watch for me. Actually, this may have been the first Bruce Lee. The thing, it's hard. It's hard for me to remember a time when I wasn't aware of Bruce Lee and his films. So I'm trying to go back to that time. So I would have seen Dragon the Bruce Lee story where there are elements. There's a sequence towards the end where they recreate the mirror fight scene. And I remember then seeing Enter the Dragon, I think was the first Bruce Lee film that I saw, and actually being a bit sort of not disappointed, but like, what on earth? What was that? I think it was probably just because my cinematic tastes weren't quite that evolved at that age.
Mm.
So I was used to seeing, 90s blockbusters, I guess, at that age, and probably expecting a similar cinematic experience that you got with, a big movie like Dragon the Bruce Lee story. And Enter the Dragon is a low budget movie, by 70s standards. It's, I think, $500,000 was the budget for the movie, which is peanuts even back in 1973. So you're dealing with that. But also just the 70s aesthetic, the whole sensibility, the vibe of the movie. It's it's a product of its time, isn't it? Let's be honest. So I think there was a few elements there that sort of I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And then I think once I then got into the Hong Kong movies of Bruce Lee, revisiting Enter the Dragon, and then just absolutely loving it. I think I went through a period of just watching this movie most weeks, most months growing up. It's one of the few movies I can probably recite every line from as well. And even to this day, yeah, I probably watch it like once a year. It was really nice to revisit again, actually, for this.
I'd only be impressed if you could recite the words from the film whilst also looking like your dialogue was off slight sync from your mouth while saying
yeah.
it. Like there's
Yeah.
like a slight desync from
A
what
few
you're saying.
moments like that.
Yeah.
We need an internet delay.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's chucking the dial-up sound.
Yeah.
But like, I'll chuck in mine real quick. I'd never seen this film.
Really?
Wow.
I'd never seen it. This is a first watch. Which for
Wow.
listeners, you'll know that isn't a new thing for me. I'm an idiot, but I've now seen it. But we'll get to what I think in a bit. Cam, I'm sure you've experienced this dragon before.
I did, and it was largely because of my friend Mark. I'll pay tribute to him now. He was the one I've referred to dragging to some of the lesser Pierce Brosnan Bond movies. He didn't have strong opinions about what we went and saw as kids, whereas I did, so I got to choose pretty much everything. But I remember, we would watch a lot of action movies, and at a certain point, we saw a movie that was very important to us, and that was Mortal Kombat. And Mark fell in love with Mortal Kombat. He was a karate student. He, I think, got his first Dan black belt over the course of his life. He had to stop training once he had kids and what have you. But he became absolutely obsessed with Mortal Kombat, and I remember they were doing a re-release of Rumble in the Bronx with Jackie Chan, and the way they marketed that movie was using the score from Mortal Kombat in the trailers. And Mark called me, and for the first time in his life was like, we have to go see this movie. And so we went and saw Rumble in the Bronx and fell in love with it, and proceeded to see every Jackie Chan movie they re-released around that time period. Super Cop, Mr. Nobody, just the whole, or yeah, that's right, Mr. Nobody, and the whole string of them that showed there, Operation Condor. And a lot of them were retitled, but nonetheless. And I remember at a certain point, Mark wanted to watch also some other things. So after we'd kind of run the gamut of what our video store had to offer, by the time you're watching Jackie Chan's The Protector, you're like, I need something else. This movie is not good. And they only had for Bruce Lee a VHS of, it was called Return of the Dragon, but it's actually, I believe, Way of the Dragon. And it was like the dubbed, maybe slightly edited version they released in North America. And we watched that movie, and it just didn't really connect with us. And we were like, coming off of these like just unbelievable Jackie Chan films, our first experience with Bruce Lee didn't grab us. I guess I experienced Bruce Lee seeing him in the past as Kato, because they did a 2-parter on the Batman 66 show. So I would have seen that, but it didn't hold like a ultra strong memory. So I really regard Return of the Dragon as my first real introduction. And it was actually quite a space of time between watching that, and then Mark and I just started exploring other things, because we were kind of like, we're good on these for a while. And it wasn't until I think I picked up Enter the Dragon at the library and watched it, and just really loved it and thought it was absolutely fantastic. But yeah, like in terms of like Bruce Lee, he was never one I went back to. And I think at the time I was a little snobby, and I wouldn't have this attitude now, but it was like I was watching movies that were very much where martial arts movies were at that point in time, like that level of choreography with the Jackie Chan stuff of that era, that going backwards 20 years felt like going backwards 20 years. And so I didn't have as much appreciation as I really should have. But again, I was like a teenager.
There's some real symmetry between both of you, actually, in your experience with this film. Like, you both kind of went in with strange expectations that maybe you shouldn't have had in retrospect, but that's what happens. That's totally fine. But like, you were both sort of blown away with it over time, which I guess we'll get into. But for those of you who have never seen the film, much like me, don't know what it's about, here is your letterboxd.com synopsis, and boy oh boy, is it short. Enter the Dragon, their deadly mission to crack the forbidden island of Han. A martial artist agrees to spy on a reclusive crime lord using his invitation to a tournament there as cover.
Yeah.
Yep. That's the film, folks. We'll see you next week. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, to be fair, I appreciate the sort of brevity there. Just straight to the point.
Yes.
Yeah.
I learned a lot, weirdly, watching a behind-the-scenes documentary of this one, getting ready for it. But I know, Cam, you've definitely got the info for us, which I'll swing to in a second. But it is interesting, just sort of the Bruce Lee conversation. Maybe we'll have a bit more of it later. But like, I felt like I knew tons about Bruce Lee going into this film, and it turns out I knew nothing about him because I'd never seen a single Bruce Lee film. This is my first, but I'd seen him appear in other stuff, and I'd also seen like is it meant to be Bruce Lee in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood?
Yep, that is supposed to be him. Yeah.
Yeah, so that I've seen that sort of nod to him too. But yeah, like I don't think I was quite prepared for Bruce Lee until today, which I think we'll get into. But Cam, I did sort of tease it there. Can we talk about how we got to this dragon?
Yeah, well, I want to get Ben to maybe set this one up a little bit. Just where was Bruce Lee at this specific point in time?
Well, the thing about the Enter the Dragon story is it's sort of all roads lead to Enter the Dragon, but also the sad part of the story, obviously, is that all roads sort of end at Enter the Dragon as well.
Yeah.
So you have a situation here where Bruce Lee is pretty much on the cusp of becoming what he always wanted to be, which was bigger than Steve McQueen. The biggest action star in Hollywood. He is pretty much there with this movie. And the sad thing is, obviously, he passes away I believe he passes away 20th of July. The premiere was in August. So just a month out from the actual movie. He did actually see the film before he died, so he did see a rough cut of the movie when he was back in Los Angeles. He also met with Lalo Schifrin and did some work on the score. So he did see the movie, but it just was a rough cut. So where he was at with his life at this stage was that all of his efforts and all of his energies had been channeled into getting a project together that would introduce him to Hollywood, to the West, so that he didn't have to remain in Hong Kong, where he was making quite low budget movies at the time. Although they made him a huge star, they made him a huge local star, whereas Bruce Lee always wanted to be a huge movie star. He always wanted that. He wanted the fame, he wanted the fortune, he wanted the glory, and this was his ticket into it. So it is bittersweet in many ways, this movie. Also, it shows how much dedication he actually threw himself into this project as well, which I'm sure we can get into the details around that. Maybe to the detriment even of his health, the way that he threw himself into the movie. And I think he just knew that, he had been denied by Hollywood for so many years since he moved there and was trying to break out. Yes, he played Kato on TV in The Green Hornet. He was second fiddle there. He had to wear the mask. He'd had moderate success in sort of small TV roles. And he was always trying to get that project off the ground and maneuvering and trying to get into meetings with the top Hollywood execs, pitching ideas, auditioning for things, but it wasn't really happening. And for many reasons, but the predominant reason being whether 60s Hollywood was actually ready to see, a Chinese guy fronting a big Western American movie. So Bruce Lee dealt with a lot of, sort of setbacks along the way. And that was why he then obviously made the move to Hong Kong, where he was offered a two-picture deal with Golden Harvest, which then made him a really big star. It made him such a star that it then became almost inevitable that Warner Brothers would eventually pitch an idea to him, because it was sort of impossible to ignore, the storm that he had created through his work by that point.
Yeah, and so where I guess I'll come in is just talking about the producer, Fred Weintraub, who around the point where Bruce Lee is looking for like a big vehicle, became convinced that Hollywood could make a good martial arts film because he recognized that there was a popularity. These movies were often screening in, lower rent theaters and becoming very popular. And so he persuaded Warner Brothers to roll the dice on this, to make a Hollywood martial arts film. And he met with Bruce Lee's production company, Concord, about doing it. And as we've said, this was Lee's first mainstream American film. And Warner Brothers, they were interested in making this movie, but they really didn't even know how to market it. And so they were actually holding seminars trying to determine how to market the film to differentiate it from the lower budget dubbed Chinese martial arts films that were in all these lower grade theaters. So like they really didn't even understand how to sell a movie like this at the time. Whereas nowadays it seems so commonplace, right, to see a quick cut trailer and a lot of flashy choreography. But in 1972 or something, when they're working on the production, they're still baffled as to how to market this.
Yeah, no, and just further to that point, I mean, this was the first time that an American crew had actually been over and filmed in Hong Kong as well. So, that's I know that there's co-productions do happen quite commonly now, but this was obviously the very first time that had ever happened. So, and that brought with it all manner of complications, shall we say. But yeah, you're right. They were dealing with a new thing. You got to remember the Kung Fu TV series that Warner Brothers made, which Bruce Lee auditioned for. That became a huge hit early '72 when that came out. So there was precedent for this. It was in the air. It was in it was very much the zeitgeist of the time. And a lot of people didn't even know, they'd never even heard the term Kung Fu before. That was a whole new concept to them. So Bruce Lee is right person, right time, but also the only person really at that time who really had pardon the pun, the chops to actually deliver the goods, because at the end of the day, whatever you think of the movie Enter the Dragon, you come away from it thinking, well, that guy's the real deal. There is no CGI in this movie. Bruce Lee is the star. He's such a powerful, amazing screen presence in this movie. It was almost destiny. It was bound to be that this, he was gonna make it in this genre, as I say, right place, right time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I wouldn't worry. Your chop pun was better than my kick pun earlier.
I did a mental thing there. I was like, should I say that? But there you go. I said it.
And there is an interesting, strange duality going on at this sort of time because, we talk about spy movie connections, which I'm sure Cam will get into, but you talk about what happened to George Lazenby at the end of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. He leaves because he thinks that, spy films are out of vogue. And you talk about kung fu movies are starting to become sort of vogue at this point, start to fall into it. And then a few years down the line, you've got George Lazenby and The Man from Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he was he sensed where that trend was going in a sense.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, he just probably shouldn't have left Bond. But that's a whole other discussion right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was a Bruce Lee movie, Man from Hong Kong. And Golden Harvest had set up. In fact, the day Bruce Lee died, he was meeting George Lazenby for lunch to discuss him appearing in Game of Death, which was the movie Bruce Lee was going to work on afterwards. So yeah, he'd arranged to meet Raymond Chow and George Lazenby for lunch that day, and that was the day that he died. So yeah, and George Lazenby's career is fascinating.
Really
he goes from Bond to then appearing in Hong Kong action films, which is fascinating.
Yeah, and so like you mentioned Game of Death, but like I believe at the time Bruce Lee was developing Game of Death, and he was co-writing, going to direct it and star in it, and ended up jumping over to Enter the Dragon because that opportunity presented itself.
Yeah. You got to remember in the early 70s, so things really ramp up for Bruce Lee once he signs with Golden Harvest. Then The Big Boss becomes this all big selling hit across Hong Kong. First Hong Kong movie to gross, it grossed millions of dollars. Big international success as well. That then enters Bruce into the stratosphere, and he's working pretty solidly then right up to the moment of his death, really. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Game of Death, he was filming once he wrapped on Way of the Dragon, which he then got the call, I believe, from Warner Brothers to then go out and sign the contracts for Enter the Dragon around that sort of time. And then the filming took place in Enter the Dragon in early 73. So I think early January 73. And then the filming takes place January, February, March 73. And then the next step for Bruce Lee then was what he should have done. Hindsight 2020, he should have just taken a rest and just taken a chill pill for a little bit, but Bruce Lee being Bruce Lee, and I think the fact that he knew he had a good movie on his hand with Enter the Dragon, he had been in the wilderness for so many years in Hollywood. I think he probably overworked himself at that stage, didn't listen to his body and just carried on working. You're absolutely right. He then picked up Game of Death straight away to then work on that. And then then he passes away then in the summer. So
yeah. And so a little bit on the people working on the film as well. So the writer was a first-time screenwriter, Michael Allen, and this was his debut, and he wrote the initial draft in 3 weeks. And he said basically from putting pen to paper and a film being finished, it took 4 months. So this was a very fast effort for him. And he does not have like a big filmography. I think only 7 credits on IMDb. But he also wrote the Isaac Hayes movie Truck Turner, which is a total blast. He worked on the 1980 Flash Gordon. And his last credit was the 1998 Jonathan Taylor Thomas film, I'll Be Home for Christmas.
What a career.
It's a diverse filmography.
That's a roller coaster right there, isn't it?
That really is. And the director, Robert Clouse, apparently only one director wanted this job. I can imagine there would have been a fair amount of snobbery in the 70s about taking on a martial arts film.
It happened with 60s and spy films as well.
Yeah, totally.
Same thing. Yeah.
And Robert Clouse is really interesting because he was actually completely deaf.
Oh.
And so he had a very strong visual sense, and he had assistant directors with him to help him with like the dialogue. And he was right out of the gate pretty successful. He had 2 Oscar-nominated shorts in the '60s, and then made his debut with 2 films in 1970. He had Dreams of Glass, which was a drama, and then Darker Than Amber, which was an action film starring Rod Taylor, who we talked about with The Liquidator.
Hey, good old Rod Taylor.
Yeah. And this film was his follow-up to an episode of the TV show Ironside. He was also a screenwriter, so he was doing screenwriting assignments kind of around this point as well. And he is someone who, after doing Enter the Dragon, went on to do a number of martial arts films. He did Black Belt Jones, Gymkata, the China O'Brien series with Cynthia Rothrock, and he also finished Game of Death after Bruce Lee had passed away, and wrote the book, Bruce Lee, the biography, in 1989, part of which was adapted loosely into Dragon, the Bruce Lee story.
Bring it all back home.
Yeah.
Bruce got on well with Robert Clouse. I think he's one of the few people during the production that he actually did get on with, because he had huge fallings out with definitely Michael Allen, the writer, and a big falling out with Fred Weintraub as well during production. So, Bruce Lee was not immune to his own sort of diva moments, shall we say. But Bob Clouse, he got on with, I think he agreed on Robert Clouse directing because he could tell that he could be flexible on certain things. He was someone who was open to suggestions. He wouldn't sort of close down Bruce Lee's idea. Bruce Lee, I think, felt that he was a good director, as someone that he could work with. And you're right, his track record, he's not the most flashiest of directors, but yeah, he introduced Jackie Chan as well, because he directed The Big Brawl or Battle Creek Brawl. He introduced Cynthia Rothrock as well. Yes, the China O'Brien movies. He was the one who was put forward to direct and finish Bruce Lee's unfinished Game of Death. Well, I don't know if you've seen that movie, but it's an interesting one.
It's a little bit of a, I think, Trail of the Pink Panther.
Bit hokey.
Yeah, where it's kind of cobbled together, isn't it?
Very much so. Yeah. It's got cutaways from Bruce Lee's other films as if he is sort of, acting within that film. It's very odd. It doesn't fully work.
Right. That's like one of the outstanding ones I haven't seen, because I'd always kind of heard that, but I should complete the journey.
The last part of it, which is the genuine Bruce Lee footage where he's fighting Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Danny Nosanto, I mean, that is amazing. You suddenly just, the film comes to life and you realize what's been lacking throughout the whole movie.
Right. A few other production notes. Rod Taylor from The Liquidator was going to play the role that John Saxon played in the film.
No way. I could have had the Liquidator in this film. That would have been great.
Yeah, it did not work out, and I found various reasons. Part of the, I don't know, like, I don't know if it's ever been hammered down specifically why, but one thing I saw that popped up a couple times was that Bruce Lee felt that he was too tall for the role and wanted someone a little bit shorter.
Fair.
Yeah, and I think he wanted someone. John Saxon did have a karate. I think he's a karate guy. He had martial arts in his background, so could, hold his own during the fight scenes as well.
Yeah. And during production, Bruce Lee is a huge star, known to be this just formidable fighter on screen. And so a lot of the stuntmen and locals in the area wanted to fight Bruce Lee. It's a battle of egos, I suppose. And so Bruce Lee spent a lot of time having fights with people on the set and outside of work of Enter the Dragon, and apparently always was victorious.
That's the myth anyway. That's the legend.
That's the myth, yeah. But print the legend, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
To be fair, like I don't think I'd be surviving that fight.
No, not a chance.
You see how fast that guy moves? Oh God.
I think a lot of the extras as well, this is in Robert Clouse's book, were just employed because they have 300 extras in this movie. So a lot of them were sort of gangsters. There was a lot of gangsters or people with triad connections or gang members. So a lot of people that they were pulling in to form a lot of the extras were not necessarily came from, let's say, colorful backgrounds, So yeah, there was the odd challenge and like provoking of Bruce, and there is stories where extras would shout things like, "Oh, you're not as good as you think you are," or challenging Bruce. But he would always, and there is a story where he does actually call one of the extras down at one point and sort of shows off some of his moves, and quite promptly that would then have caused a lot of people not to shout back. So yeah, there are instances, there are stories on set where Bruce Lee was um, showing off his moves for real, shall we say.
I mean, I don't know the story behind what happened with Bruce when he passes away, which I'm sure Cam will get to in a minute. But was he
Mhm.
quite tense when he was shooting this film? Is there like a lot of pressure on him? Because that feels like you're acting out a little bit. You could just say no to these fights. It
Mm.
doesn't have anything to prove, surely.
Yeah, I did come across an anecdote where they said he was incredibly nervous about shooting this movie, just because I think all the pressure of it
Mm.
being this massive Hollywood production, and he didn't shoot for the first 3 weeks of production, and when he did, he was so nervous that it took them 27 takes to be able to get a good take they could use.
Wow.
But he obviously was off and running, once he was plugged in. But yeah, it was a project that I think put a lot of pressure on him, and I think someone who you just think of like a Bruce Lee in the 1970s in Hollywood, what he would be carrying on his shoulders when you are dealing with potentially being a star.
Yeah, Cam, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's the same sort of mess I was in before we hit record with Denise Richards. Like I was just a quivering mess on the floor.
27 takes.
Yep, that's
Yep.
what the intro took for sure. We definitely re-recorded that.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, Cam, and I think it's the culmination. You got to remember that he's been waiting his whole life for this moment, and he's worked so hard to get there as well. That and he was someone who did put obviously immense pressure on himself, and I think with just reason he was nervous as well because this was unprecedented. So actually give a Chinese actor such a lead role in an American film.
Mm.
There wasn't really any. He was sort of the first person to do this, and he had just reason to be nervous that I'm going to be stitched over by the American producers here. Someone needs to take control of this production, or that his fear was that he would be ultimately shafted in the edits. John Saxon, I know, John Saxon really didn't think much of the production. He got a holiday to Hong Kong out of it. He didn't think much of it, but I know that he was coaxed into it very much as saying, "You're the lead here." And if you look at the movie, he is the only character who has any serious story arc.
Yep.
He starts off as a bit of a gambler. And then at one point you think he's going to be coaxed into actually joining Han and his operations, and then obviously he kills his buddy, and then he has that sort of emotional scene. He's the only character in the film with any sense that as a sort of fully rounded character. Even Bruce Lee had to really fight to add anything to his character here, to add any sort of depth. I know he fought really hard to put a lot of his own philosophy and his approach to the martial arts into a lot of the scripts. None of that was there in the original script that Michael Allen presented. So he was nervous, but for just reason. He thought, if I don't really commit ultimately to this, then the project's going to run away from him. But I think as soon as the rushes started coming in, and once he'd got over a lot of the issues that he had, particularly around the script and working with Michael Allen, once he was fully on board, no one could deny what he was turning in was just magic. So Warner Brothers then very quickly had to appease to their star, because they knew they had a winning formula on their hands.
Yeah, and they were looking to book him for a second film as well and pay him $1 million. And then, of course, he passed away July 20th, 1973, of a brain edema. And so that obviously was never going to happen. And this film premiered, as Ben said, less than a month after his death at 32. And the studio actually boosted the marketing budget for the movie because they realized that the world wanted to see this movie. And so they really got it out there, and it was a big hit. The budget was $850,000. Domestically, it did 25 million. International 65 million for a worldwide total of 90 million dollars. And so in like 1973, that is big money.
Sure, I think like what that return is, like mathematically speaking, that's a very good return.
It's one of those returns like the original Halloween where you're just like,
Right.
holy smokes, when you compare the cost versus what they brought back, just massive.
And it's also had one heck of a legacy. So I
Mm-hmm.
imagine like VHS sales, DVD sales, Blu-ray sales all throughout the years have really propped this one up too.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. And I mean, the top three for the year: number one was The Exorcist, number two was The Sting, and number three was American Graffiti. Because this is the earlier 1970s, it's impossible to find like a top 200 chart. But Into the Dragon did very well.
It has to be sort of top 20 for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else for Cam?
Couple things I'll just say, like the success of this movie led to many early Hong Kong films being dubbed and re-released in North America, and with Bruce Lee's passing, also led to a lot of other clone Bruce Lee films. So there was various actors: Bruce Lee, L.I. There was also L.E. And then there was also Bronson Lee, who had a Charles Bronson mustache and was Japanese.
Oh my god. I need to see this person.
There's Dragon Lee as well. Korea's answer to Bruce Lee was Dragon Lee. He made some great films.
Was there any gems in these films, or were they all kind of disposable?
The thing that happened, obviously, as soon as Bruce Lee dies, you've got the kung fu boom, and its leading star is dead. So what do you do there? You've got a massive void, and these unscrupulous producers very quickly latched onto this idea of these what are now known as Bruceploitation films. So are they any good? Well, it all it all depends what your tolerance levels are for these kind of like trashy movies. But
Uh-huh.
one or two of the Bruce Lee films are actually quite good. I'd certainly recommend. He did a movie called Dynamo that was pretty good. A lot of these though were, just straight ahead crime movies where they would take on Bruce Lee's mannerisms,
Hmm.
but some of those movies were directly referencing Bruce Lee. So a film like Bruce Lee, The Man, the Myth is essentially a forerunner to many biopics that followed on as well. But Bruce Lee, The Man, the Myth is probably held up as one of the better Bruceploitation films, as it was quite faithful, and it was done definitely in tribute to Bruce Lee and his values and what he brought to the martial arts and movies in particular. A lot of the movies though are quite trashy.
Okay.
And as that subgenre continues throughout the 70s, they just start eating themselves. So you get movies like The Clones of Bruce Lee, where the film starts with Bruce Lee is being rushed to the hospital, and then he's announced dead at the hospital, and they
Oh.
quickly take some of his DNA and they create these clones of Bruce Lee. This is a real film, by the way. And Bolo Yeung is actually in this movie, who's in Enter the Dragon. And they clone Bruce Lee, and then you have Bruce Lair. I forget the other Bruce Lees that are in that movie now. So pretty trashy stuff, but that just shows, I guess, what a void Bruce Lee's death caused in the Hong Kong martial arts film industry. People in the grindhouse cinemas and definitely overseas were lapping these movies up to the point where a lot of those Bruce Lee clones have their own fan base even now, and even I have a soft spot for those movies, even though most of them are pretty terrible. Um, and that just shows really why Hong Kong cinema is crying out for a new thing to take over from Bruce Lee, which then thankfully we had Jackie Chan arrive, who was very much the antithesis of Bruce Lee, where Bruce Lee was very intense. Jackie Chan was more slapstick. He turned the joke on himself. He wasn't afraid to actually get hit a few times. And then that idea of kung fu comedy started becoming more prevalent in the 70s. And then you had the whole new wave then of Hong Kong action stars.
It's fascinating to hear all this because this is all completely new information for me, and this is why you are the expert here, Ben. But like, if you look at what happened during the '60s, the sort of explosion of Bond copies, which I think I'm now going to coin the term Bond exploitation,
Yeah.
That's never been said before. I'm patenting that, everyone. Bond exploitation films. Well, like you got the Dr. Goldfoots, the Derek Flints, everything like that. All to OK Connery, all that sort of stuff. Where you got Sean Connery's brother playing Bond, basically. All that sort of insanity that you get in the late '60s sounds like it happened basically again the next decade, but for kung fu movies.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And there's a certain charm to those movies, I'm sure. As a fan of the genre, you probably enjoy seeing these slightly sort of knockoff versions.
Not the Goldfoot ones.
Um,
No.
Depends.
No.
Yeah, it's a hit and miss. We mentioned the Liquidator with Rod Taylor earlier, so I guess that's all connected.
Yeah. And just bringing us full circle, of course, 1993, Dragon the Bruce Lee story comes out, the origin story for Ben. And that is also the same year that Brandon Lee, Bruce Lee's son, is killed in a tragic prop gun accident on the set of The Crow. So yes, the curse of the Lee family continued.
Wow, that's that is a shame. But I think we should celebrate a little, and let's actually finally talk about Enter the Dragon. Let's start the tournament loud and proud. Our first contestant, our competitor in the ring, is Ben. Ben, I want to hear from you. 2023, you've visited Enter the Dragon many, many, many times, but what do you think of it in the year 2023?
Well, it's an interesting one. I still, for some reason, I think probably this is to do with the age you are when you watch certain films, particularly around the age when you're quite impressionable and still sort of finding your feet. You're looking for references and things that you can call your own as well. So I still have a soft spot. Every time I see Enter the Dragon, it still sort of takes me back there. But I always see new things in it as well, which is quite surprising, really. I still find the movie completely captivating, particularly Bruce Lee's performance, his energy, his versatility, the way he moves. Just there's something so cool and unique about him. There really isn't. This film's 50 years old. It was released nearly 50 years ago, 50 years ago in August. There's not been anyone like him before or since, really. And I'm saying that with 50 years worth of kung fu movies on top of that. I think even hardened martial arts fans, martial artists would agree that he was a pretty unique guy. And yeah, I just can't think of many other people that you can compare him to. Now the movie itself, I cannot profess to say this is certainly not Citizen Kane. This is not a great work of literature or anything, is it? It's a pulpy B movie that was done very much on the cheap, that Warner Brothers really didn't throw a lot of money behind. They weren't too sure about it themselves. The fact that we're still talking about it, having this conversation, it 50 years later, is purely down to one reason, and that is Bruce Lee. With anyone else, this movie I think would have been long since forgotten. I would imagine.
Sorry, when you said about it being 50 years, it occurred to me that when this is actually coming out, it's about a couple of weeks away from the 50th anniversary. I just did the math. So
there we go.
Yeah, that's crazy.
The timing is perfect.
All planned. All part of the plan. Yeah. We're going to edit that part out, Scott.
Yeah. That's fine. Well, fine. Well, Ben, I'm glad you still love it. It's clear that it's one you hold near and dear to your heart. I'm going to save me to last because I'm interested to hear what Cam has to say, because I suppose you're both the two that have seen it before. I'm the fresh eyes. So Cam, what have you got?
I loved watching this movie last night for the show. I think it was interesting comparing watching Bruce Lee now and having obviously been a huge fan of Jackie Chan. I think the difference for me is kind of like the Fred Astaire, Gene Kelly thing, where it's Fred Astaire, his whole goal in all these musicals was to make his dancing look effortless. And that's kind of like Bruce Lee. There's a coiled intensity. He's unstoppable. He'll take people down with one hit. It's he's like a machine. And you look at Jackie Chan, he's more like the Gene Kelly, where his whole thing was, I want to show the work. I want to see people to see that I'm exhausted, that this is tiring, and that I am taking hits and it's not easy. And, Gene Kelly famously was he roll up his sleeves in all these musical numbers because he wanted to look athletic. This took work. And I think that's very much the case when I look at these two stars now in contrast to each other. And that's one thing I really loved last night about watching this movie, was just seeing like how Bruce Lee, every shot of this movie, he understands the camera and how to come across in an incredibly iconic way. Like, this is, to me, comparable to, John Wayne or Clint Eastwood in like their best westerns. When they walk on screen, everyone's eyes are on them, and the camera loves them, and they know how to perform for the camera in a way that's so specific, but a skill that like very few have. And to me, like, what I love about this movie is like, it is like, in terms of its storytelling, it is a B movie. It's, borrowing from various things we've seen. There's a lot of Bond, crossover we'll I'm sure talk about, but there's like an imagination to this movie. I find a lot of, say, like the lesser martial arts movies, you're kind of waiting to get to the martial arts scenes. Like, the storytelling stuff can feel like sometimes a little bit of a slog. But here, there's so much wackiness and invention, and it feels very comic booky. I think at one point, one of the characters said, Jim Kelly's character says of the villain, like, you belong in a comic book. But like, this movie has the energy of a comic book. It's fun and vibrant. And so like, even when there's not action scenes going on, I'm just like interested in the world of it and in the scale they create, where they just, have like the big villain party where everything's so colorful and there's something to see in every shot of the frame. And I look at also like when they show up, and it's just like the camera sweeping over the entire grounds of all the various fighters meeting for this tournament. There's an imagination to the scale. I think, Robert Clouse has made a movie that just visually is dynamic to look at, and it's paired very well with a star who knows how to hold the screen and is clearly a movie star.
It's interesting sort of seeing what they came up with here, because as Ben was saying, there's not a lot of budget behind this film. Like, there wasn't a lot of faith behind this film from the powers that be. It sounds like it was like a roll of the dice. Like, we'll toss you this 850,000, see what you can do, and lo and behold, they had a mega hit on their hands. I suppose for me, and I think I'm going to be the contrasting voice on this one a little bit, and I'm sorry to people who love Enter the Dragon.
Uh-oh.
I'm gonna rain on this parade just a wee bit. I can hear the tweets tweeting in now. I didn't hate this film. This is not me saying I hate this film. I heard all about this film for the last 20 odd years of my life or whatever. This is like the best martial arts film of all time. It's wall to wall, like, kick ass. It's great. And there are bits I liked about this film, and that was actually a lot of the martial arts and sort of seeing Bruce actually like flex and do his thing. And when he's actually like kicking and punching and leading and sort of in charge of the screen, I'm drawn towards it. But there was a lot less of that than I was expecting coming into this film. And so what I'm left with is like 10, 15 minutes in between action sequences. Now, of course, it can't be an hour and 40 minutes of action. A film can't really do that. John Wick tries to do that, but even that has to have some dialogue at times. But I suppose I just wasn't really drawn into what was happening in between the scenes. I didn't really care about what was going on. I didn't really understand many people's motivations. Ben, you quite one of the things I wrote down, you pointed it out actually, is there's not really any character journeys apart from John Saxon's Roper. It's basically more about just sort of the spectacle that you're watching here. And it's a gorgeous looking film. The cinematography is wonderful. I want to get into that. I love the action sequences, but it just left me a little bit cold. And it's one of those things where like people build something up for you and it doesn't quite deliver for you. I remember hearing about A Fish Called Wanda and how that's the funniest film ever made. And someone died watching that film. It was so funny that they burst their appendix from laughter and died. I'm like, this has to be funny, right? And I got like 20 minutes in, I didn't laugh once. I thought, this is crap. What's going on? And I'm not saying this is crap, but I suppose my expectations weren't met. It didn't burst my appendix. I didn't die from laughter watching this film. And so I couldn't meet it on its vibe. Maybe I'm just not well versed in the genre of these films. Maybe that's just something. Maybe that's a fault I'm having. But maybe as a casual sort of viewer of spy movies, at least, I think it just didn't really grab me. Bombshell.
Hot take.
I don't know. I understand. I think any film that's probably it's had 50 years of I guess people. It's a much lauded and praised and hyped film as well.
Mm-hmm.
its historic significance, I think, is important to remember, as well as the biggest martial arts film and the first Hong Kong American co-production. It's standing as Bruce Lee's only American film that he made as well. There's a lot of legacy, there's a lot of history tied up in this movie, and a lot of emotion as well, because this was a movie that really kickstarted that whole kung fu boom in the 70s, caused so many people to rush out and buy nunchucks and to take up karate. And I think Fred Weintraub says, before Bruce Lee, most American high streets didn't really, you wouldn't have found like a gym or a dojo there. And then as soon as Enter the Dragon comes out, that then becomes, a huge thing. So I think it's the film's cultural significance is probably felt in ways that you probably don't even realize, but in today, that go beyond sort of the influence of it just being a movie as well. So many people were inspired by Bruce Lee as well as a result of being captivated, I guess, by this movie. But again, it's not a classic by any stretch of the imagination as a piece of storytelling. But yeah, I do, and also I think the other thing to remember is just where we are at in the action film industry in 1973. It's really hard to think back to a time when action movies really, particularly martial arts films, I mean, gosh, Bruce Lee's sort of inventing the genre here around this time, in being, because even in Hong Kong, throughout the 60s, the Shaw brothers were the main, producers of Hong Kong martial arts films, but they were all based on the old literature of the past, in which there was lots of sword fighting and sword play, the wuxia, they're known as wuxia films, martial chivalry. But that's the type of film where the heroes were on wires and flying around with swords. It takes the early 70s to when, Hong Kong starts to move more into kung fu cinema, as in actual, hand-to-hand combat. That was still very much in its early stages as well. So if you compare, particularly if you compare the type of choreography that was going on even in Hong Kong around that time, Bruce Lee is literally, his choreography is head and shoulders. And to this day, I will stand by this. If you look at Bruce Lee's fight choreography, maybe the Bob Baker fight in Fist of Fury, maybe if you look at his fight with Chuck Norris in Way of the Dragon, his fight choreography is really fantastic. It still holds up today, I think. It's very hard hitting. It was the first fight choreography where you looked at it, and Bruce Lee was very specific at this. He brought his own people over to spar in his movies. Bob Wall, for instance, in Enter the Dragon, was one of his students, someone he trained with, and Chuck Norris as well, who he knew very well. He brought these people over because he knew they could take the hits. And nothing looks better in a fight scene where you have a little bit of contact. Why does John Wick look so good? Because Keanu Reeves is doing the moves. He's actually doing these judo throws. He's throwing people to the ground. There's full contact, or what can be perceived as full contact. Bruce Lee was introducing these things into his fight choreography even back then in the early 70s. It was really something you didn't see very often. So I think that's why his choreography particularly resonates today. It still has a real punch, has a real impact even today.
I'm reminded a little bit, my sister watched Citizen Kane this past week, and her takeaway was like, yeah, that was good, but it didn't grab me.
Sure.
But it's like so much of what Citizen Kane is accomplishing was just been absorbed into the DNA of all movies that you kind of don't recognize what's special about it anymore. And I think there's a little bit of that with Enter the Dragon, but I can bring up something that actually may be a little helpful for you, Scott, which is like, this movie comes out in 73. The biggest studio action film of the year, also a Warner Brothers movie, I believe, is Magnum Force.
Okay.
And, the second Dirty Harry movie, which we covered on the Patreon. And you kind of like look at what they are, both hitting in terms of action choreography and just like speed. Like, this movie to me feels very breezy and quick paced. And it feels like when you compare it to an action movie now, it probably feels slow, but it was quicker than what was going on in the 70s otherwise in especially your studio movies.
Listen, I didn't mean to come across like cold in my top line review.
No.
I'm not like dropping bombs on this film. I just don't think it really clicked for me. I felt like it was missing something for what I was looking for. But I think you're probably spot on, Cam, with your analysis there. That it's like, I what I'm seeing in this is, I'm watching films now, and it's basically they've evolved from this. This is like the beginning, and I'm now looking at the end of the equation. John Wick being a great example of that. And it took me a long time, as another example, and red alert, it took me a long time to appreciate Star Trek the motion picture.
Sure.
It's not a film I instantly warmed to. I had to watch it like 3 or 4 times before I was like, actually, you know what? It's slow as F, but it's doing something really great. And it took me a long time. Maybe this will take me a few more times of Dragons to sort of get me on board. But I on my initial 2 viewings, I watched this twice. I found lots to appreciate, which I'm going to take us to in a second. But as an overall product, I just felt like it left me a little bit cold. And I want to try and unpack why that is with you over this next couple of sections of discussion. But let's talk about things that we liked first. Ben, you've already kind of led us off with the sort of fight choreography there, but is there anything else you wanted to highlight?
As to things to like about the movie?
Yeah, just give us something. I'm sure the whole film is your answer.
I will just say this as a caveat. I mean, I'm gonna just gush over this movie throughout this whole podcast, but I will also just say that I am a realist as well, in the sense that I actually think the film Bruce Lee would have made after this film would have been better. That's this, obviously the sad reality of what happened. Even the title Enter the Dragon, Bruce Lee, Warner Brothers then, after this movie, approached Bruce Lee to then, well, Bruce Lee's argument was, and he fought tooth and nail to call the film Enter the Dragon. The film's original title on the script was Blood and Steel. There was a huge debacle over that, and then the studio came back to Bruce Lee and said, we've got all the marketing execs together, we're going to call it Hans Island. And Bruce Lee was adamant, no, this film needs to be called Enter the Dragon, or else I will not come back and do the sequel, which would be called Return of the Dragon. So he very much had the intention that this would be a longer running series. There would have been sequels and so on. So whether Enter the Dragon 2 would have been better than Enter the Dragon 1, who the hell knows? But all I know is that he would have had the world at his feet after this film had been released, and he had offers coming in left, right, and center, even that he was aware of, during his lifetime. Opportunities to work closer with Shaw Brothers, movies to finish Game of Death, that would have completely changed as well. The opportunity I read somewhere and in someone's book to work with Elvis Presley, potentially do a movie with him, because Elvis was a karate guy, so there was potential talk of Bruce Lee and Elvis doing a movie together. I mean, that would not have been good, would
it? There's no way. No way.
You're not going to solve that one, but yeah, it would have been something. It would have been a film.
It would have been a film. Yeah, definitely. So, the opportunity, I think, the opportunities that were open to him after this film would have been great. It would have been amazing to have seen what he could have achieved as well after this movie.
Well, it's a movie that, you realize what's special about him. At least I do when I watch the movie, and that, there are so many actors who can be an action hero. They show up, they hit their marks, and they come across on screen really well. But I think what's really interesting about Bruce Lee is the way he's actually working in emotional performances through his action. And one of my favorite bits is when he goes up against the scar-faced guy who was involved with, the murder/suicide of his sister.
Mm-hmm.
And when he kills him, when he leaps on top of the guy's neck.
Yeah.
And that could be played as just a quote-unquote badass kill in so many action movies. But you watch the emotion that comes entirely through Bruce Lee's face when he performs that act, and the kind of the moment of pause after it happens. That's someone who's not just, I'm just here to hit my marks. I love Van Damme movies quite a bit. Van Damme does not really bring, I find, that level of emotion to his action. And I think that's something really special. And another favorite moment I had of Bruce Lee's performance was when he has the snake. First off, the catching the snake sequence, incredible. The moment where he releases the snake into the booth and then just sits there looking very bored while all that is, taking place
Mhm.
is happening, where the guys are scampering all over trying to get away from the snake and diving out the window. But like, what an interesting decision for Bruce Lee to just sit there looking very bored. That's not the sort of thing most actors would do, especially in their first Hollywood film. That's not the sort of thing you'd want. You want something that's a little more dynamic, a little more like showy. That is not what he does, and I think that's so cool.
I do love that moment, Cam, as well. And it actually points to a wider thing about Bruce Lee and his cockiness and his attitude, which he was like that in real life. I think no one can deny that. Um, but he brought that into his Hong Kong work, and it was something that the American producers were really sort of nervous about. I know in Bob Klaus's book, he apparently said to Bruce to try and I think he said to get rid of that strut that he had in his Hong Kong movies because they felt that that wouldn't play too well, particularly as this sort of cool, undercover. Well, he's a Shaolin monk, isn't he? But supposedly working for British intelligence. This idea of a James Bond figure probably wouldn't go around acting, all nonchalant about these things and showing off. But it creeps into the performance there, and it does in that snake scene. It also does in the Bob Wall fight, where he just starts sort of teasing him. He brings the Muhammad Ali shuffled legs into that fight scene, and just his general demeanor and his attitude, of who Bruce Lee was in person does start to come out. And contemporary action stars of that time were not like that. They were a lot more stoic, a lot more, particularly in the spy films. I'm sure we'll talk about that. A lot more buttoned up, shall we say? And Bruce exudes a certain confidence that just wasn't prevalent, particularly in the action stars of the early 70s.
Or even like the moment where he's fighting Han, and Han like claws his face or whatever, and he like touches the blood and then licks his finger. Like, you're not seeing Clint Eastwood do that in one of his movies.
No. And that's the thing. All these things are so iconic now, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
Well, just to sort of answer to Cam's point, I think the seeing the emotion on his face was actually really interesting, and you say about that choice with the snake is also fascinating. I think there's a couple of other moments, like when he learns about the fate of his sister as well. He has like a subtle bit of acting going on there that really stood out to me that I was quite impressed with. I did the guy with the scar on his face. I did write down in my notes as Barry Gibb from the Bee Gees that he was fighting. So that's
he didn't stay alive.
He did not stay alive. He did go during the whole fight though. So yeah, but
we should say that's Bob Wall, and he was he sadly passed away. He only passed away last year in his early 80s, but he did appear on I did interview Bob Wall on the podcast.
Wow.
So and he did have a lot of very favorable things, I think, since Bruce's death, because they were so close. They were training buddies from the early 60s. Well, mid 60s. That he was very close to Bruce, and obviously worked with him on Way of the Dragon and Enter the Dragon as well. And throughout his all these years that Bruce hasn't been with us, he's always been a huge champion in supporting Bruce and passing on that sort of positive message. But yeah, Bob Wall, and he said to me a quote that I remember from that conversation. Do go back and check it out if you haven't heard it yet. Bob Wall said, "No one gets good without getting their ass kicked," which I thought was a good sort of way to improve in life. It's a good sort of motto to have, and also it points to the fact that he was one of Bruce Lee's favorite punching bags. He gets his ass kicked in Way of the Dragon, and he certainly gets his ass kicked in Enter the Dragon.
Well, but just I would just say, like, it was a great fight to watch. But like, that's the stuff I really enjoyed about it. Firstly, was just watching Bruce work his magic. Like every fight, I did a little poll throughout, like what was my favorite fight, because I thought it'd be a question we'd ask later, and maybe we will. But most of the fights that Bruce Lee's in, it are tremendous. There's no like bad moment for him in terms of the action sequences. I can't take my eyes off him. He's so electric, and he feels like he's got that sort of Sean Connery tightly wound thing about him that he had for when Sean Connery was playing Bond as well. Like, you just don't know what he's capable of. There's so much like he's storing in him at all times.
Well, at least the first couple Bond movies, once Sean Connery showing up in Diamonds Are Forever, you know what he's gonna do.
He's escaping the moon buggy.
Yeah, exactly.
But I shouted out cinematography earlier. I just want to shout out the score.
Yeah.
Lalo Schifrin never lets you down. He's like, him and Jerry Goldsmith are like my two favorite composers basically now from going through all these films over the last 3 years. And as soon as that like 70s funk hits when the credits start rolling, I'm like, yes, we're in for a very good time. And he doesn't like the entire film is just full of bangers that Schifrin's putting out. I absolutely love the score to this film.
Did Mission Impossible score as well, of course.
Yeah.
Another Spy connection.
He's got quite a few, Schifrin.
Yeah. I mean, it just adds millions to the movie, really, doesn't it?
Mm.
A good score can really transport a movie, and this is a clear example of that. Fantastic music, Lalo Schifrin. Again, that was an afterthought. That was in the $300,000 they put aside for post-production. That was once they knew they had the rushes back and they knew they had something good. Warner Brothers then suddenly found some more money to really put into the post-production, and that's when Lalo Schifrin comes in to add the score, which just transforms the movie. It's brilliant.
It's great. And I mentioned the cinematography. I just wanted to shout out there's some really cool like POV shots in this film. I don't know if that was a staple of the cinema at that sort of time, or this was pushing boundaries. But like, if you haven't seen the film, folks, basically like it's exactly POV as you would think of it. Like you're seeing the opponent throwing punches at the lens, and then like it's reacting to it. It's really well done. You're seeing both sides of the fight, but you're in the fight with them. I just think that was really wonderfully done.
When you're talking about like the cinematography too, like you look at that mirror fight at the end of the film, which very influential. John Wick Chapter 3 did a very similar sequence. But like, this would have been like viewed as something of a inexpensive B movie by the studio. And you look at the ambition of pulling off that mirror sequence. If you want to have an easy cinematography assignment, don't set your entire sequence in a room full of mirrors. That is a nightmare. And they are paying homage to the Orson Welles film Lady from Shanghai, which was a noir film from 1948. Orson Welles was viewed as one of the biggest virtuoso directors alive. And here you have this kind of down and dirty action movie, and Robert Clouse directing it, like creating a sequence that was inspired by one of the greatest visual filmmakers in the history of the medium. So to me, like the level of ambition behind the cinematography is just astonishing. And you can just see how like you could have handed this same assignment to a different director and a different team, and you would get something that no one remembers. But like there's like real magic going on here. And I think honestly, there's a lot of limitations with budget, but sometimes that's better because they're kind of hands off when the budget's low, like they are less invested. Had they given him way more money, I don't know that you would have gotten a movie that has this level of just creative ingenuity under very often tough circumstances.
And I think it connects beautifully to a film that comes out exactly 1 year later, which is James Bond's attempt at a kung fu movie, The Man with the Golden Gun, where you get a mirror sequence, very much not quite the same as this, but definitely riffing off of it.
Yeah, and you also get Bond at the I think was it karate school in that one, I think?
Yeah, he's at a karate school. They do an exhibition for him, and then he decides to beat everyone up because he's Bond.
Just kicks the guy in the head as he's bowing over. But, which Bruce Lee apparently was supposed to be in that as well, or there was rumors that Bruce Lee was being.
Could you imagine?
Yeah, was going to join the world of Bond. Yeah, that would have been incredible.
It would have been incredible. And there's the bit at the start of this movie where he's talking to like a student and says, never take your eyes off your opponent, even when you bow. And that's something that the Bond film 1 year later has Bond kicking the guy in the head when the guy doesn't keep his eyes on Bond. So like you can definitely see the influence, and you can also see this movie, as I said, like under $1 million budget, and look at the phenomenal action work it has going on. And then look at The Man with the Golden Gun, which cost a lot more money, and compare the martial arts sequences between the two.
I don't want to, Cam.
Absolutely.
I don't want to compare them.
Yeah.
Roger Moore, not a virtuoso.
Oh, no. Well, maybe this is a good time because I was going to put it at the end, but we're talking about it. The Bond and spy movie connections of this film before maybe we go to sort of down to this film. Like there's so much.
Yeah, and I'll just say this was actually was the genre
Right.
mashup of this movie, because I think when you go into a likes on Enter the Dragon, everyone's going to say Bruce Lee, right? Because
Mhm.
that's what makes the movie so cool. But like this movie's ability to blend like the martial arts film with like a spy film, I think it does it incredibly well. It
Yeah.
does not feel like the gears like grinding to like make these two things work simultaneously. When you have this character Han, the villain, the way he reveals like his lab to the John Saxon character Roper, it goes full Bond.
Mhm.
He's walking around literally stroking a cat. And I was like, oh my God. And you've got him, with interchangeable hands. So you have like an iron hand, like Dr. No at one point,
Mhm.
and then, blades and claws by the end. Very like mix of Dr. No, but also a lot of the Bond sort of adversaries he'd go up against, like the henchmen. And I mean, the whole lair sequence is so much fun. And it just feels like it has taken this pivot into kind of like your Bond spy film, but does it so seamlessly that it doesn't feel jarring to me. It feels like a natural extension as to where we were going, even though when you break the movie down into sections, it feels bizarre that we wound up there.
It feels completely out of place, but like it absolutely works. And there's more like connections too. Han's Island is Spectre Island. Like for anyone who's is following the sort of Spectre story, like that's the training school that Spectre go to. I wouldn't be surprised if Han ran the Spectre Island. We just never saw him in the Bond films. I could totally see them being connected.
Well, did you notice also that they set up that it was like in uncertain territory, like
Hmm.
between borders of various nations? And it's like, well, that's something they pulled in No Time to Die.
Yep. Hmm.
Yeah.
Spot on. And like, we mentioned the lair. You've also got like an M with Braithwaite. He turns up in, a British spy master giving the exposition, which we love in our spy films. So yeah, a ton of connectivity. But I suppose, Ben, I'll throw it to you as the sort of, I always say spy movie novice, James Bond fan, but comparatively speaking, novice. How do you find the spy connections, and does it work for you in a sort of a spy lens?
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because I think it does. I think it does work personally. However, I know that was obviously that was in the first iteration of the script. So that's first script that Michael Allen produces is very much all the Bond elements are in that. Even to the extent that Bruce Lee's character was supposedly a spy working for the British government. So that was clearly not going to wash for Bruce Lee, given the fact that he is, Hong Kong action star. Bruce Lee is in a tricky position here where he has to make a movie that's going to appeal to a burgeoning audience in the West and in Hollywood. Um, but also he's a Chinese star. He needs to look after his local audience as well. And he is not going to do that if he is representing the British, who are the colonizers of Hong Kong. And particularly, we're following some pretty heavy political rioting that was going on in Hong Kong at the time. Bruce Lee's previous films were very nationalistic. They promoted the plight of the Chinese against oppression, particularly Fist of Fury, where the villains were the Japanese. To see him play a spy working for the Brits would have been definite no-no. So Bruce Lee had these arguments with Michael Allen, and a lot of the disputes around the script came about the origins of his actual character, which then he managed to create, and that's where the background of his character being a Shaolin monk comes from. So he is being recruited
Mm.
by British intelligence, but he is not a spy. He is an expert in martial arts. He's aware of Han's tournament. Han is a renegade Shaolin monk. And in order to restore, I guess, Chinese dignity and national pride, he needs to go and take revenge because this former Shaolin monk guy has just gone absolutely bananas and is cooking up heroin and injecting it into slave girls, whatever he's doing in his little underground lair. Um, and also, he adds this revenge element where his sister is killed. So it's a personal journey for him. And also, the final line, "You've offended my family, you've offended the Shaolin Temple." That is his motivation. It's not working for the British. It's not to hunt down for this guy because the British have sent him to do that. So that was a really important sort of subtle shift in the script that Bruce Lee made in order to protect his following back home, essentially. Though it didn't really help, because Enter the Dragon actually did not do very well in Hong Kong. I think his earlier films, the box office was much more. This is one of his least successful films in Hong Kong, which again is quite telling as well.
Right. Yeah, I think wasn't that kind of the case with Jackie Chan too, where like his American films didn't do particularly well in Hong Kong?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because it's hard to appease different audiences as well. I suppose. And Bruce Lee always had this trouble during his life. He was Eurasian born. He was born in San Francisco, but obviously his heritage, he has European heritage. He was Chinese. He was raised in Hong Kong. He lived most of his adult life in America. So he was constantly battling, I guess, between these two parts of his life in many ways. There were times when he would be in Hong Kong and he felt more American and out of step and out of off kilter, and then he'd be in America where he was being told he was too Chinese, that he wasn't getting work because of because that's what they were saying. He was too Chinese. So it was a battle that he constantly faced throughout his life.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Calling all agents. Keeping the lights on at SpyHards HQ ain't cheap. And frankly, nor is feeding this school of attack piranhas. So we need your help.
Roger that, Scott. Only at the SpyHards Patreon can you gain access to exclusive shows like Agents in the Field, which tackles non-spy films starring your favorite spy icons, and The Debrief, where we channel our inner solitaires and predict how the big spy movie news of today will impact tomorrow.
So make like a Treadstone agent and activate your Patreon membership at patreon.com/spyhards today. Cam, tell the people what we have in our sights this week.
Scott, it's the end of the month, so that means it's time for the latest episode of The Debrief. This month we're going to talk about Secret Invasion. We'll have the series finale to talk about at this point, as well as Christopher Nolan Bond rumors, and so much more. It's going to be a ton of fun.
But before this message self-destructs, Cam, resume the spy chinks. Well, I think it's time we transfer over to the downsides, the things we didn't like. I'm guessing that Cam and Ben's entries in this saga will be very quick, and I'll be talking the entire time. But I'm going to put you on the spot, though, Ben. Is there something you could critique about Enter the Dragon?
Oh, golly. It's a tough one, isn't it? I mean, I think the one thing I remember thinking maybe when I first saw it was probably similar to what you said around... I mean, it's an action movie, but, and it really ramps up towards the end, but it's not wall-to-wall action, and there are slower parts to the movie. That's why I think a lot of really hardcore Bruce Lee fans probably, and I've heard this quite a lot, would favor a movie like probably Fist of Fury, potentially. If you were to say, what's your favorite Bruce Lee movie? I just think he's so damn cool in all of his movies. But there's some really iconic, great fight scenes in Fist of Fury. There's some great Bruce Lee moments in this movie as well. It's hard for me to actually pinpoint something that I would say that I didn't like about the movie. So I'll take a beat on that one. I'll hand back over.
It's okay, because you did kind of highlight something that I briefly spoke on earlier, which is sort of the bits in between of the highlights, I would say, like the moments in between, the scenes of exposition, the scenes of moving the story along. I love watching the tournament and actually getting on with the tournament and seeing the exhibitions in front of Han. That's all great. But I'm not sure I want to spend 10 minutes watching Jim Kelly's Williams getting off with 8 girls.
Don't need that.
I don't. It didn't add anything to the film for me, except for the cool sort of score that went along with it. So that's kind of the one things I had. So I suppose that's maybe where you're coming from, and especially from your first viewing at least. Maybe you appreciate that a bit more now, having seen it 30 times. But yeah.
I think you're right, and I think also I'd say, I mean, this is a disappointing thing, is that there are other things that are pulling focus away from Bruce Lee in this movie. And as you say, yes, whether it's the Jim Kelly, whether it's the backstory with John Saxon, whether it's the other conflicting elements, I think those earlier movies that Bruce Lee made, he is such the center of attention that and it's a Bruce Lee film. That's what you want. You just want to see the guy kicking ass, taking names, just doing his thing. And I would say if that is maybe the downside of Enter the Dragon, is that there's almost not enough of him there.
Yeah.
You can always have more of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd probably say that.
And like the Williams character doesn't really get any sort of background apart from sort of the introduction scene. You don't really know why he's there particularly, or what his goals or objectives are, apart from, I suppose, winning the tournament. Although I don't know what one gets when you win the tournament, because that's never set up either. It's just sort of
who even wins the tournament. I don't know if that's ever
the
established.
viewers win.
The viewers,
Yeah.
we all won.
We all won.
Cam, I'll throw it to you. What about you?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, in terms of like the supporting characters getting a lot to do, I guess it would bother me more if they were boring to me. But I found like Jim Kelly and John Saxon were giving such kind of odd and quirky performances that I was on board for it. But we also brought up what my dislike is, and it's something that's so common to kind of exploitation films of the era, which is like the female characters have a real rough go of it in this film. I mean, you get that Bruce Lee's sister character gets at least a big action scene, but she is, going to be the victim of sexual violence basically over the course of her introduction.
It's a great scene though. Great scene. Love it.
Great scene. Fantastic action scene where she has some agency in terms of where that is going. So I give them some points for that. But like when you get to like Prostitution Island and it's all these women like hooked on drugs and they are just like playing up like all these guys like, oh, I get how many women? And you're like, wait, you just told us these are all women who are being like hooked on drugs downstairs. Like that's pretty unsettling. So common though with these types of movies of this era, also with blaxploitation films as well. I mean, I give them points for making it weird. Because there's the fight with Jim Kelly where he gets like thrown through like the wall, and there's like the drug room, and these women have like bizarre like heart makeup on their face, and they're all cackling while he gets killed. And I'm like, that's surreal and odd. But in terms of like, the movie just wants you to kind of like be horrified at what the villain's doing, but at the same time completely ignore it when it comes to our heroes.
Well, firstly, we all know where Cam is going on holiday this year. No judgments here, all right, Cam. You do your thing. You stabbed that passport, buddy. No, I totally. It is a weird thing that there's like a moral implication here that's never really dealt with. But I think that just happens a lot with films around this era, especially the '60s as well. And this is sort of a byproduct of the '60s. James Bond never really took a look at what he was doing until Timothy Dalton came along, really.
Yeah, and also you've got Ahna Capri as Tanya, who's kind of like the madam who's overseeing this whole operation. Like she's pretty fun in the movie, but like they give her no ending. They just cut to her like dead on the ground at the end, and I was like, wait, what happened?
Yeah, I feel like she's really underserved here. It's a real shame. It's like, are they building her character up? Oh no, she's dead. So yeah, it is a real shame that and all the female roles in this film are pretty. Yeah, it's and it is very much it's a product of its time. And you're absolutely right. You could label the same thing to those early Bond films as well.
Oh yeah. But also you've got like Betty Chung as like Mei Ling, who's like the agent they actually have embedded on the island. And you look at like how little she even gets to do, and it's like that's a pretty important character in theory.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a really interesting Golden Harvest movie that they made after this that was one of the films Bruce Lee was going to make with George Lazenby. And you should track this out and definitely give this one a look. It's called Stoner. Do you know this film, Stoner?
No.
George Lazenby. So Angela Mao, who plays Bruce Lee's sister in Enter the Dragon, so she's the one who does that wonderful fight scene, but then kills herself with the glass. She steps into the Bruce Lee role. And that's really interesting. Hong Kong kung fu movie where they're sort of fighting crime together. It's George Lazenby and Angela Mao. Very dated, very of its time. But again, I think the fact that you have Angela Mao with this agency and actual, more of a rounded character. I mean, her own films that she made around this time in Golden Harvest are really quite interesting when you look at the types of roles, particularly that were afforded to women around that time. I mean, she was very much, the sort of defiant hero. She's kicking ass. She's like leading the dojo into battle, and all of her films around this period. Are really quite, I guess, sort of forward-looking in many ways. So, yeah, and I'd certainly check out some of her work that she did in the Golden Harvest years, particularly Stoner. Not seen that for a while, but I'm sure that would be a really interesting movie to review and to check out. I reckon.
That sounds like a Patreon film if I ever did hear one.
Definitely. Definitely.
Well, I'm just gonna then just say my quick dislike that no one's really spoken about too much, and that is the dubbing.
Yeah.
Now, I really can't stand dubbing when it's done in the Bond films around this time in the 60s, where you get the Bond girls are often overdubbed with, because usually they would get like European models play some of the Bond girls, and then they would get, American or British actors to do the voices instead. In this film, the entire film is overdubbed, and it was recorded with that in mind, basically, from what I can tell from my research. If that's what they were doing at the time in this sort of cinema, absolutely fine. I can understand why they stuck with that. But as someone who's viewing it in 2023, especially when the lips don't match a lot of the time, and we've even had someone on the show when we were speaking about Ghost in the Shell who actually does dubbing as her job. And I know the efforts that go into doing overdubs. I understand how hard it can be. But when it's done badly, it really just sort of annoys me, I have to say. Like, I can't get past that, so it becomes comical.
Yeah.
And when they're trying to deliver like anything particularly emotional, it just like it triggers like a funny bone in my elbow, I guess, or whatever, and I just can't really take it seriously. I guess it's no big deal for some people, but it does jump out for me.
What's interesting about the dubbing as well is so Kien, who plays Han, it was a sort of needs must situation with him because his English just wasn't quite there.
Mm-hmm.
So he is actually dubbed by Ki Luke, very famous Chinese actor, appeared in a lot of American movies. He was Master Po, the blind monk in the Kung Fu TV series. Wonderful booming voice. So when he talks, you can tell that's not coming from Kien. But equally, also dubbing was part of the course, particularly in the Shaw Brothers and a lot of the movies that were made in Hong Kong at that time. Just because of the congestion, the general noise there was, it wasn't, the audio that it would pick up just through the nature of filming in Hong Kong. But also the dubbing was so they could sell their films more easily, obviously, to different international markets. Sure. They could overdub different dialects and so on and so forth. So that was common practice in Hong Kong at that time to film with no sound. So all those old Kung Fu movies are done, with no sound. It's really funny that even continued into the 80s. And, a lot of the Western actors that would appear in Hong Kong movies, because they filmed with no sound, they would be made to do dialogue scenes and then just say random words so that it looked like their mouths were moving. Right. And they would say, well, we're going to add the words on afterwards, so it doesn't really matter. So a lot of those Cynthia Rothrock films, she'll just be saying like rhubarb and custard over and over or whatever, or just counting to 10. A lot of actors just counted to 10. And then they would add the dialogue on afterwards. So yeah, it was common practice at the time.
I totally understand, and that it's just something that sort of bumped me, but I guess I'm not well versed in that, so I can leave that where that is. I suppose then before we go to the knock list, it's sort of final notes time. I had one note that I'm just going to leave us on, and I realized during my second viewing of the film where I had the first experience of Enter the Dragon. And this is a reference that will play to a portion of our audience listening, and will probably play to Ben, because we're about the similar age.
Yeah.
Cam will have no idea what I'm about to say.
Okay.
But my earliest reference to this film comes from a song called Do You Really Like It by DJ Pied Piper and the Master of Ceremonies from the late 90s, early noughties garage scene here in the UK, because the song starts with Enter the Dragon, and then they have a video which is all themed by Enter the Dragon. I went back and watched it today, and I was like, oh yeah, and the lyrics don't really play anything into it, but it's actually still a really good tune. If anyone liked garage
Yeah.
in that sort of time period,
That's a banger.
yeah, great song,
Yeah.
great song.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I do really like it, and it is wicked. So Cam, I'm sorry you were left out on that one.
That's fine. That's fine. I feel like you're left out for many things. It's my turn.
Okay, I'll send you the song afterwards. You can let us all know what you think of it.
It's a classic.
Ben, Cam, any notes you have left? Ben?
Well, I mean, I guess I've probably gushed enough about the movie, other than to say, you know, the impact I think that this film had in obviously sparking the big, the kung fu boom, is really quite. It's sort of the Big Bang, really. It sort of starts this whole craze that we're talking about. It is important to see this film within the context, I guess, of when it was made. I would just add that, if you haven't seen it and you want to see what all the fuss is about, Bruce Lee is someone who, is so iconic. And I do think that he's someone who continues to resonate. I mean, we're 50 years later, we're still talking about this guy, and they're still making movies about him as well. Ang Lee is just about to make a new biopic about Bruce Lee. So there is an appetite out there. It's as if his story resonates a lot more nowadays, more around particularly the attention that's been paid in more recent years to accurate representation and what it means to be, I guess, a minority working within the industry, particularly within Hollywood, and trying to get those voices heard. The battles that Bruce Lee was facing in the 60s and 70s are still being faced today. And although we are making, a lot of progress in that world, staggers me that Bruce Lee achieved what he did achieve in just 32 years. He was very young when he died. Look at what he did actually manage to achieve against all the odds. I think that's partly why the film is so revered and why it is so significant, really.
Far less than I have.
And you can even look at, Shang-Chi.
Absolutely.
The Marvel film opened in theaters, and that was a comic book character created to try to capture the popularity of Bruce Lee. So you can see that the influence of Bruce Lee just continues to this day and is being carried now by Disney is putting out multi-million-dollar blockbusters inspired by him. So that's very cool. A couple final notes I had. The sequence where they are darting apples out of the air was very cool. I also had, this movie does not like New Zealanders very much.
No.
The New Zealander fighter's just like a total jerk, picking on the guy carrying oranges on the boat, and then just gets his butt handed to him in the first fight. And there's the scene where there's kind of the gambling comedy bit going on with John Saxon gambling, and there's a gentleman with a Hitler stash. Interesting style choice.
Yeah, he had a look. He was clearly doubling down on it.
It's brave.
He'd invested by that point. He's like, I'm not shaving it now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is my look. No. And just the other thing I had was I referenced earlier that the movie Mortal Kombat was a big deal for me growing up. You can map Mortal Kombat on top of this movie. It is so close. Even, Bolo is very much like the Goro role in the film. He has in this case, it's a kick in the nuts, but in the Mortal Kombat, it's a punch in the nuts is the finishing move. The whole thing lines up very closely. And John Saxon is very much Johnny Cage.
Yeah. Well, there's a very rich, subgenre of martial arts films that are just based around tournaments. I'd be hard pressed to find one before Enter the Dragon, but that's a direct link that goes through to Mortal Kombat, but Bloodsport is a tournament movie as well. That's a very iconic, Jean-Claude Van Damme movie. The Undisputed series, the tournament movie was huge in the 90s, and all those straight to video movies that I love, but are broadly terrible. This very much, is describing it as the Big Bang for martial arts movies. So much, springs from this movie.
Yeah, and also video games, Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, all those games. Yeah,
totally. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I think it's time to answer the big question that we tackle here every week on the show. Is Enter the Dragon making the knock list? Now, Cam, as we have a guest, just walk Ben and the listeners through what the knock list is.
Yes, the knock list is our need to see. official classics of the SpyHards canon, a very tortured acronym. But every week after talking about a movie, we decide if it belongs on the list of the all-time great spy films. So some movies that have made it on. You've had kind of like your lofty dramas like, 3 Days of the Condor. But then you've also had Bond films like Goldfinger, Casino Royale, 2006. And then even some, curiosities along the way, like the first Flint movie or the Saoirse Ronan film Hannah.
Good movie.
Yes, so it's a diverse list, but it is quite particular when it comes to our voting. So it is a list of the best spy movies ever of all time. But yeah, we have had some outside ones. Ghost in the Shell is an anime, but that made the list. If you take it from a spy lens, I think it's a very fascinating film to dive into. So let's talk about it. Knock list time. We have 3 votes between us. Could go any way. Ben, I have a feeling I know your answer for this one, but I'm going to pitch it to you anyway. Is Enter the Dragon one of the greatest spy films of all time?
Wow.
Now, I will preface that we've agreed this is a spy film, so you haven't got to fight for it as a spy film. It's whether you think this is one of the greats.
Gosh, well, far be it for me. You guys are the spy movie experts here, so I'm very much a novice into this world. We're agreeing that this movie fits within the spy genre.
Mm-hmm.
I would say within the spy action genre, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a better action martial arts spy film that so specifically pulls on, I guess, the sort of tropes of the spy genre. I'd be hard pressed. I'd probably need to think of any martial arts movie that does it as well as Enter the Dragon. So, gosh, I don't know. Yeah, I think it's I think it's up there. It's a pretty good spy movie.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, you are on. You are standing firm, and you are on the right track because you've been saying you love this film throughout this whole episode. So that's a yes. It's also to play for. Cam, you're up. Yay or nay? Is it making the knock list?
Scott, you and I spent a lot of time talking about 50-plus-year-old spy movies that no one remembers. This is one that the world continues to remember. It's a huge yes for me, not just for the legacy of the movie, but just honestly, we previously talked about Kiss of the Dragon, right? And I look at the comparison between the two and what they're setting out to achieve, and this one does it so much more. Whether it's just the central performance of Bruce Lee, but just the iconography of the movie, the visual imagination. I thought the pacing was very strong. The movie just sucks me in every time I see it, so it's a huge yes for me.
Okay, this is one of those weird ones where I'm just voted out basically now. So it's 2 yeses. But I will chuck my 2 cents in. I completely agree with what both of you have said. Cam, if you compare this to Kiss of the Dragon, obviously it's not. I mean, it's Streets, whatever the saying is. It's far better than it's much better than that film. Totally get that. Ben, in terms of it being we've agreed it's a spy film and it's definitely a film that you love, so I completely get your perspective. I don't think it works for me, personally speaking. I don't think it was a home run that a lot of people say it is. I'm not trying to be the contrarian. I'm not trying to be that guy that's doing the hot takes on Twitter. I don't care about any of that. It just intrinsically, when I watched it, I didn't feel that sort of. For me, the knock list is very much I feel it in my gut when I say yes or no. And for me, it wasn't quite there. It was very close. I understand why Thunderball made the knock list, but I didn't vote for it.
Yeah.
I understand why this is about to make the knock list, even though I didn't vote for it. So I'm happy it's on there. It just didn't do it for me. I'm just glad Ben was in there to sort of help vote it on, because it could have been a very big disappointment for other people if it just been the two of Cam and I.
Well, you should throw it over to your listeners, see what their thoughts are on this one, because it's a kind of hybrid movie, isn't it? Really, it pulls on a lot of different genre tropes, I would say. So yeah.
No, for sure. I mean, we love to hear from you guys. If you think we're wrong or we're right, let us know on social media. But there you go, folks. 2 yeses, 1 no. The dossier is complete and filed as classified. Enter the Dragon is making the knock list. Everyone else on this podcast is very happy right now.
That's right.
I'm not unhappy, to be fair. I'm glad it's there. And I'm glad there is some representation for a martial arts film on the knock list, because it's added another sort of wing. It's great, and I'm glad it's there. I'm glad Bruce Lee is on the knock list. How cool is that?
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
How cool is that? So, Ben, I want to thank you for taking the time, joining us on the show, talking about one of your favorite martial arts films. I want to hear from you. The listeners want to hear from you. The Kung Fu Movie Guide. Where can people find it, and what have you got coming up on the podcast?
Thank you, Scott. Yes, and thank you, Cam. Thanks for inviting me on. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat about Enter the Dragon. I normally just bore my friends in the pub around this subject, so it's great to great to actually do it on a podcast. Yeah, so what are we up to now? Season 7 will continue. So just having a little break at the moment while sort of put the feelers out there for more guests. We're up to 90 episodes of the podcast now. As you say, been running for quite a few years. It's available in all the usual places that you get podcasts, so Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and so on. The website's kungfumovieguide.com. That's the best place to go to. That's where I sort of regularly update latest film reviews and any thoughts on the genre go up there. And we're on all the social medias as well. So Twitter at KF Movie Guide. We're on Instagram and Facebook as well at Kung Fu Movie Guide. Yeah, give us a follow. Check out the show. Give us a like, star rating, all that good stuff that you say. All of that's super great to help to promote the show as well. So yeah, thank you all so much again. Yes, and thank you for inviting me on.
No, it's been our pleasure. And, there'll be links to all of that in the show notes below for everyone wants to go and check that out. And we will be tagging in Ben basically on social media wherever we're blasting this out. So you'll be able to click on the links through that to find the two. I will just say before I let you go, is there an episode of the podcast you could recommend people go and check out? And we'll put a link to that in the show notes below as well. Sort of a one that connects to this maybe a little bit.
Definitely, yeah. So Bruce Lee obviously is featured quite heavily on the Kung Fu Movie Guide since its inception. It's always, Bruce Lee I just find endlessly fascinating as a character, as an actor, as a martial artist, and his life story. So I've been lucky enough to speak to quite a few people who knew him, including his daughter. So Shannon Lee, I'd definitely check out that episode. Chatting to Shannon was awesome. Bob Ward is actually in Enter the Dragon. He plays O'Hara, passed away last year. Go and check that episode out. Who else? I've had Bruce Lee's goddaughter, Diana Lee Inosanto, has been on the show. So
Wow.
That's Diana Santo's daughter. Diana Lee Inosanto actually enjoying a bit of resurgence at the moment after her wonderful performance in The Mandalorian. So definitely go and check that episode out. There was a compilation episode that I did when Bruce Lee would have turned 80. So go and check that out, because that's more of a compilation of various guests that I've had on the show over the years. So lots of actors who now make martial arts movies who are inspired by Bruce Lee's movies. So it's a nice little compilation, I guess, of the legacy that Bruce Lee continues to inspire, future generations, whether they're martial artists or actors or people entering the industry. Bruce Lee's story still continues to resonate quite powerfully with people. So definitely go and check out that episode. I think it's just called Bruce Lee at 80. Various other episodes as well. Do check out the show.
Well, I think the Bruce Lee 80 sounds like the perfect entry point for everyone listening, so we'll put a link to that in the show notes below.
Definitely.
But Ben, one last time, thank you for coming on SpyHards.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, there you go, folks. That was our chat about Enter the Dragon. It is making the knock list, and as such, the dossier on the film is complete and filed as classified. I want to thank Ben Johnson once again from the Kung Fu Movie Guide for coming over and bringing his expertise on the show. But I'm about Kung Fu'd out now, Cam. I feel like I need a holiday. What have we got coming up next week?
Well, you said it, Scott. I need a holiday as well, and we are going to be in Las Vegas, so there won't be a normal episode out, but we will have a very exciting Spy Master interview for all of you with Ivana Milicevic, who played Valenka, Le Chiffre's accomplice and girlfriend in 2006's Casino Royale.
Yeah, never mind Safin. She was the one who almost put James Bond away all the way back in Casino Royale.
That's right. Yes.
There you go, folks. So yeah, Cam and I might be away, but we've still got plenty of spy jinx for you. So your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to tune in next week as we speak with Miss Ivana Milicevic and discuss her work on 2006's Casino Royale. And if you like what you heard on this episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star review wherever you're listening, and do not forget to follow us discreetly on social media at SpyHards. That's SpyHards on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. But until next week, listeners, we'll be too busy looking cool.